The morning sky was still dark when 12-year-old Julia sat up on her mat. Her tiny hands reached out for the wooden tray beside her bed, where a pile of small, ripe oranges waited. She had washed them the night before. One by one, she began to arrange them in a bowl, gently checking for bruises. Today she would go to the market again. Maybe she'd sell enough to buy bread. Maybe not. From the other room, low voices drifted in. Her mother and grandmother were arguing again. "I told you, Mama, the money is finished." Her mother's voice trembled. "But what of the money from the last batch?" Her grandmother whispered back. "I used it for Kenny's medicine. He's still burning up. He couldn't even eat yesterday." There was silence for a moment. Then the grandmother sighed deeply, the way someone sighs when they have no answers left. Julia sat quietly, her arms wrapped around her knees. She knew what they were talking about. Her little brother Kenny had been coughing badly for a week now. His eyes were red, his body hot like fire. They had taken him to the small clinic down the road, but the nurse there only shook her head. "No payment, no treatment," she said. Julia blinked hard, forcing back tears. The last time her mother begged the nurse, she had sold her wedding ring, her old sewing machine, even Julia's school books. But it still wasn't enough. Outside the window, the village was quiet. Too quiet. Once upon a time, children used to run around laughing. Mothers would sit on wooden stools, plaiting hair and sharing gossip. Boys would chase each other with sticks. But not anymore. 2 children had gone missing in just the last 3 months. The first was a 10-year-old girl named Tina. She had been walking home alone from the stream when she suddenly vanished. She never got home. The second, a girl named Anita, was last seen playing near the mango tree behind his compound. No one ever saw them again. There was no ransom note, no footprints, no clues. Julia stood up slowly, slipped on her worn-out slippers, and picked up the bowl of oranges. Her dress was faded and torn at the side. She had outgrown it months ago, but it was the only one she had left. As she stepped outside, the cold morning air touched her cheeks. The market was a 40-minute walk away, and the road was full of red dust. She started walking, one step after the other, bowl balanced on her head. She thought about her brother, about the clinic, about the silence in her home. When she reached the edge of the market, she found her usual corner under a big umbrella tree. She sat down and placed the bowl in front of her. "Fresh oranges," she said quietly. "Sweet and fresh." Most people just walked past. She had sold only 3 when she noticed a man standing a little distance away, watching her. He was tall, dark-skinned, with silver hair and a serious face. He wore a fine native caftan and sandals that didn't touch dust. He looked like someone who didn't belong here. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just stood there for a long time, hands behind his back, staring. Julia looked away, uncomfortable. Then slowly the man walked over and crouched beside her. He pointed to the oranges. "How much?" he asked. 10 coins, Julia said softly, not looking up. He picked one and held it to the light. "Do you live near here?" he asked. Julia hesitated. "Yes." He nodded. "What's your name?" "Julia." He looked at her face for a long time, then stood up. He bought 5 oranges and left without another word. But as he walked away, Julia had a strange feeling in her chest, like cold fingers pressing down on her heart. She didn't know who he was or why he had spoken to her. But something in his eyes had lingered too long. Something in the way he looked at her made her skin crawl. By late afternoon, Julia was back in the market, but not to sell. She was now buying. Her bowl was almost empty. She had only a few small coins left, borrowed quietly from her grandmother's metal box when no one was looking. She walked over to a woman sitting beside a basket of herbs. The woman's name was Mrs. Sarah, and she was known to be kind sometimes. Julia held out the coins with both hands. "Please, I need something for fever." Mrs. Sarah looked at her face, then down at the coins. "This one isn't enough, my dear," she said gently. Julia lowered her head. My brother is very sick. Please, Ma. Mrs. Sarah sighed. She tore off a smaller piece of dried leaves and wrapped it in old newspaper. Boil this one with water. Let him drink small. But if his eyes roll back again, take him to the clinic. Thank you, Julia whispered. As she turned to leave, something made her look up. Across the road, beside a wooden stall that sold palm oil and yams, stood an old man in clean clothes. He wasn't from around here, that much was clear. His clothes were too fine, his shoes untouched by the red dust, and the way he stood, with hands behind his back and chin slightly lifted, made him look like someone used to being obeyed. He was dark-skinned, elderly, with a neat silver beard and steady eyes. His name, though Julia didn't know it yet, was Mr. James Johnson. He wasn't buying anything, just standing there, watching. He saw Julia. Their eyes met, and Julia ran off quickly. Then, without a word, he turned and walked over to Mrs. Sarah's table. That girl, he said softly. What's her name? Mrs. Sarah looked up, surprised. Julia. She's a good girl. Her brother is sick. James nodded slowly. Does she come here every day? Almost. James gave a small nod and left. He didn't buy anything. That evening, just before sunset, Julia sat outside her small house peeling one of the leftover oranges. Her brother Kenny lay beside her on a thin mat. His breathing was shallow, his lips were dry. The mother Mary had tried everything, palm oil, cold water, even prayers. Nothing had worked. They were waiting for the fever to break. That was when they heard the sound. It wasn't the sound of a kiki or a bike. It was quiet and smooth, the kind of car sound they only heard in the city far away. They stepped outside. A black car was parked just outside their compound. Clean, shiny, and expensive looking. The windows were tinted. The tires were new. It didn't belong here. Then the back door opened, and Mr. James Johnson stepped out. He wore a long blue native outfit. His shoes were polished. He held a small brown envelope in his hand. He didn't look around. He walked straight toward them. Good evening, he said calmly. Mary narrowed her eyes. Good evening. I came to see your daughter, he said. Julia stepped back. She felt her chest tighten. James continued. Her name is Julia, right? Why are you looking for her? James was calm, his voice soft but firm. I saw her today, at the market. She reminded me of someone. Mary didn't say anything. He brought out the envelope and held it in both hands. I want to make you an offer, he said. A bride price. Julia's grandmother Ruth stepped out of the house holding a small broom. What did you say? I want to marry your daughter, James said. No, Mary said quickly. She's a child and you are, well, mature. I understand, he replied. But your son is dying, and I can help. Mary's eyes filled with tears. You don't even know us. I don't need to, James said. Sometimes we do the right thing without needing to explain it. Mary looked at the envelope. It was thick. James added quietly, with this, Kenny will be treated tonight. You will have food for months. Rent, clothes, school. Mary shook her head. This is not how we do things. You can go with your money. Then she turned away. Later that evening, just a few hours after Mr. James left, the sky outside had turned dark, and the lamp inside their small room cast long shadows on the cracked walls. The house was quiet. Too quiet, except for the weak sound of Kenny's breathing. Julia sat on a stool, peeling the last orange slowly, her hands moving without thought. Her mother, Mary, had been sitting on the floor for a while now, staring at the envelope James Johnson left behind. Finally, Mary spoke. Julia, she said quietly. Julia didn't look up. Mary took a deep breath and began. The man that came, he made us an offer. Julia's hands stopped moving. Her heart started beating faster. Mary's voice trembled. He wants to marry you. He said he can pay for everything. He said Kenny will get the best treatment. That we won't have to worry about rent or food or anything for a long time. Julia turned slowly to face her. "No," she said, her voice hard. "He's old, Mama. He's even older than Grandpa was before he died. I don't want to be sold to an old man." Tears welled up in Mary's eyes. "I know, my child. I know. But Kenny is—" "I don't even know him," Julia shouted suddenly, her voice shaking. "Why me? Why must I be the one to suffer? I'm just 12. Mary's shoulders dropped. Her hands covered her face and she began to cry. "I have nothing else left, Julia," she whispered. "Nothing." Before Julia could respond, a strange sound filled the room. A choking noise. They both turned to see Kenny lying stiff on the mat, his eyes rolled back, his small body jerking. "Jesus!" Mary screamed. "Kenny!" Julia dropped the orange and ran to him. His limbs twisted in pain, his teeth clenched, his little hands slapped against the floor as if reaching for something. "Help me carry him!" Mary cried. Together they lifted him and ran into the night, barefoot on the red earth, heading straight to the small local clinic. The lights were on inside, and a nurse was at the counter. "Please," Mary begged, tears streaming down her face. "My son is dying. Please help him." The nurse looked up slowly, then at the boy. "Where is your deposit?" "We don't have any money now," Mary said. "But we will pay, I promise. Just help him." "No deposit, no treatment," the nurse said coldly. "But he's a child, please," Julia begged. The nurse looked away. They stood there, holding Kenny, whose body had now gone limp. After a long moment, Mary turned around slowly, holding her son close. And they walked home, broken. That night, inside their room, Julia sat in silence, her eyes red and swollen. Her hands were still shaking. She looked at Kenny, now breathing faintly again, sleeping under a thin wrapper. Then she looked at her mother. "I'll do it," she whispered. Mary lifted her head. "What?" "I'll marry him," Julia said, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. "If it will save Kenny, I'll do it." Mary didn't say anything. She only cried harder. The next morning, Mr. James Johnson returned. Julia stood by the door. James looked at her and spoke gently. "He'll be taken to a private hospital this evening. The best care. I already made the call." Julia didn't respond. She just nodded. But deep inside her, something didn't feel right. There was something about the way he looked at her. Something in his calm voice. The way he moved slowly. The way he smiled without showing teeth. He hadn't touched her. He hadn't said anything wrong. But still, something about him made her heart feel heavy, like a stone had been placed inside her chest. And she didn't know why. The sun had barely risen when the small compound began to fill with quiet movement. There were no drums, no songs, no laughter. Only the low sound of slippers on dry earth, the clink of metal plates, and the rustle of old wrappers. A few neighbors gathered, standing at a distance. Some held hands to their mouths, whispering behind tired eyes. Inside the hut, Julia stood still while her grandmother Ruth gently tied beads around her neck. "They are small," the old woman said, "but they will hold your name." The dress she wore didn't belong to her. It was old and faded, but still white. It had belonged to another girl, one who had once lived down the road. She had been promised to a man far away, but she never returned. No one spoke of her anymore. Julia's hands were cold. She stared at the wall, her face blank. Her feet were bare. Her mother, Mary, stood nearby, wringing her fingers. Kenny was not there. He had already been taken to the hospital James had promised. The car came early, just before dawn. A man in a suit carried Kenny inside and drove off without a word. Julia had watched the car disappear. Now, she stood alone. Outside, the villagers whispered, "Is it true? She's marrying that old man. I heard she didn't even say yes, that it was her mother who agreed. She's only 12. Her family had no choice, same as Mariam and the other girls." The old women shook their heads. The younger ones looked away. The men just kept their eyes on the ground. Although she wasn't the first child bride to get married this way, it still didn't feel right. Then James Johnson arrived. He was dressed in another clean native outfit, deep gray this time. No dust on his shoes, no sweat on his face. He walked slowly, calmly, like someone who had done this many times before. He didn't smile. He didn't greet anyone. He walked to the center of the compound and stood waiting. A local elder cleared his throat and opened a small book. The ceremony was short. No music, just a few whispered prayers, some verses. A nod from the elder. James said yes, in a quiet voice, when asked if he took Julia as his wife. Julia said nothing. No one forced her to speak. No one asked her twice. She simply stood there, her head bowed, her eyes fixed on the dry ground beneath her feet. There were no rings, no dancing, no gifts. Just stares. Just silence. When it ended, James turned and began to walk back to his car. Julia followed behind, holding nothing. As they walked past the crowd, people parted without speaking. Some turned their faces away, others stared openly. A woman muttered, "That man didn't even look at her." Another whispered, "His face, like stone." And someone else added, "Something's not right. I can feel it." James opened the car door for Julia. She stepped inside without a word. The drive was long, up a quiet hill, past the edge of the village, into a part of town she had never seen. Then, at the top of the hill, she saw it. A mansion. Big, silent, standing alone like a sleeping giant. Tall gates, clean walls, glass windows that reflected the sky. The car stopped. James stepped out first. He walked to the door and unlocked it. Julia followed, still silent. Inside, the air was cold, too clean, too quiet. No pictures on the walls, no family voices, no warmth. James led her to a small room with a bed, a chair, and folded clothes on the table. "This is your room," he said. Then he turned and walked away without another word. And just like that, she was alone. The door closed behind her with a soft click. Julia stood alone in the room. The silence was thick. No voices, no footsteps, just the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the sound of her own heartbeat. The walls were cream-colored. The floor was tiled. Everything looked too clean, too perfect. A small bed stood in the middle of the room, covered with white sheets. There was a wooden chair by the window, a soft rug, and a folded nightgown lying neatly on the edge of the mattress. She didn't sit. She didn't cry. She just stood there, frozen. The gown she wore still hung loose on her thin frame. Her hands were cold. Her mind was full of things she had heard, whispers from older girls, warnings from market women. "He will take what he wants. They always do. You're his wife now. Just close your eyes and don't fight it." Julia sat slowly on the edge of the bed. She pulled her knees to her chest and stared at the wall. She was too tired to think, but her body refused to rest. Minutes passed. Then the door opened. Mr. James stood there quietly, holding a small tray. He stepped in slowly and walked over to the table. On the tray was a steaming bowl of soup and a neatly folded napkin. He didn't look at her long. He simply set the tray down, turned to her and said gently, "You should eat." It was the first time he had spoken directly to her. His voice was soft, almost kind. Then he turned and walked to the door connecting her room to the next one. Without another word, he stepped through it. Julia heard the sound of a key turning. She sat there in shock. No touch, no harsh words, no strange requests, just a bowl of soup. She looked at it, steam rising slowly into the air. She didn't know what to think. This was not what she had expected, not what she had feared. She just sat there and stared. The soup had gone cold. The fan turned slowly above her head, casting shadows across the ceiling. Her fingers clutched the edge of the blanket, but her mind would not rest. Even after what had happened, or what hadn't happened, her body refused to relax. The silence in the house was not peaceful. It was the kind of silence that made your heart race louder, the kind that made your thoughts louder too. She lay down, then sat back up, then stood by the window for a while. When she could no longer bear it, She walked to the door. It was unlocked. Slowly, carefully, she stepped into the hallway. The corridor was wide and cool, with soft lights glowing along the walls. Her bare feet made no sound on the floor. Everything looked so perfect. Too perfect. The curtains were smooth, the shelves lined up, and the air smelled like lemon polish and something else she couldn't name. She passed a tall bookshelf, then a wide hallway with pictures she couldn't see well in the dim light. That's when she saw it. The light under a door. It was open just a little. She stepped closer. Inside was a large room with a thick carpet, a tall lamp, and shelves full of books. And there, in the middle of the room, sat Mr. James, dressed in a plain robe, seated in a brown leather armchair. He was not reading. He was just sitting there, hands on his lap, staring into space like he was listening to something only he could hear. Julia stood by the door, unsure whether to go in. Then he spoke without looking at her. Couldn't sleep. She hesitated, then walked in slowly. He looked at her now, his eyes softer than she remembered. "Come," he said quietly. She stepped forward. He reached to the small table beside him and picked up a thin notebook, handing it to her. "You should write," he said, "even if it's just your thoughts." Julia stared at the notebook, confused. "Why?" "Because stories make sense of things," he said gently, then added, almost as a whisper, "And I think you'll need that soon." She looked at him again. His face was calm, but there was something tired in his eyes, something far away. Julia turned, her eyes catching sight of another hallway through the far end of the study. There was a door there, heavy dark wood, with a strange brass handle. "What's in that room?" she asked quietly. James didn't move. His voice came soft and slow. "Some doors aren't ready to open yet." She looked at the door again, then at him. He added, "Everything will be clear in due time. But tonight, get some rest." Julia didn't ask any more questions. She walked out slowly, notebook pressed against her chest. Back in her room, she sat on the bed, watching the cover of the notebook for a long time. Then, for the first time that night, she laid her head down on the pillow and closed her eyes. And somehow, she fell asleep. The next morning, Julia woke up to the soft knock of porcelain. She opened her eyes slowly. Mr. James was standing at the door with a small wooden tray. On it sat a cup of warm tea, a cookie wrapped in cloth, and a tiny glass of orange juice. He walked in quietly and set the tray down on the small table near her bed. Then he looked at her and said softly, "Good morning." Julia blinked at him. "You don't have to come out yet," he added gently. "Just rest. You're safe here." He turned and left without saying another word. The door clicked softly behind him. She stared at the tea. The steam curled in the air, and the cup smelled sweet, nothing like bitter leaves her grandmother used to make. The cookie was soft and sweet and wrapped like a gift. She touched it carefully, like it might disappear if she blinked. That was how the next few days began. Each morning, Mr. James brought her something soft: tea, warm bread, biscuits with honey, fruit in small pieces. And each time, he said only a few words. He didn't ask her to do anything. He didn't sit too close. He didn't touch her. Julia stayed in her own room. Her bed was made for her. Her clothes were replaced with clean, soft dresses in colors like peach, cream, and sky blue. She wore slippers that didn't scrape her feet. Once he brought her a flowery red gown and said, "I thought this might look nice on you." She didn't answer. He never seemed to mind. He would knock softly, place the tray down, say a few words, and leave. He never raised his voice. He never demanded anything. And strangely, that made it harder. Julia had prepared for fear, for pain, for silence. But this quiet kindness confused her. He treated her like glass, not the kind you hide in a cupboard out of pity, but the kind you place on a shelf with soft lights because it's special. She didn't know what to do with that. Each night, she wrote in the notebook he gave her. Sometimes she drew. Sometimes she only wrote her name over and over again. Once she wrote, "Why is he being nice?" She didn't know the answer. Then one morning he came to her door and knocked twice. "Would you like to visit your family today?" he asked. Julia looked up. Her heart jumped. "Really?" "Yes," he said with a faint smile. "I already sent word. They'll be home." The car was waiting outside. It was the same one that had taken her brother away. The ride was quiet. She sat in the back seat alone, her fingers pressed against the window. When they reached her home, she saw her mother standing outside with a wrapper tied tightly around her waist. Her grandmother sat on the stool beside the fire. But what caught her eye was Kenny. He was sitting up, not lying down, not shaking, just sitting there holding a spoon and eating a small bowl of porridge. His eyes were clearer, his cheeks had color again. He looked at her, and he smiled. Julia's chest grew warm, and without meaning to, she smiled back. It was a quiet afternoon. The air inside the house was still. The clock on the wall ticked slowly. Julia sat in her room, notebook in her lap, but she wasn't writing. She'd already drawn the same flower 3 times. It was her 3rd day in the mansion. She had just returned from visiting her family. Seeing Kenny smiling and stronger had brought her a kind of relief she didn't know she needed. But now she was bored. Mr. James Johnson had gone out earlier that morning. He didn't say where. He only told her, "There's food in the kitchen. I'll be back before evening. Don't worry." She watched from the window as the black car disappeared down the hill. Now, hours later, she wandered the hallway, fingers brushing against the walls as she walked. She had already seen the study, the kitchen, the garden through the glass door. But there was one place she hadn't seen. The door at the end of the hallway. It had always been locked. But today, she noticed something different. The handle turned. It wasn't locked anymore. Julia's heart beat faster. She looked over her shoulder. The house was silent. Slowly, quietly, she pushed the door open. The room was dim but warm. A soft light from a lamp near the wall lit the space. And everywhere were photographs, lining the walls. Dozens, maybe more. Children, boys and girls, all from different places, different countries, different lives. Some were smiling, their eyes full of joy. Others looked serious or tired or unsure. Each photo had a name beneath it, and a date. Some of the dates were crossed out with a red X. Some weren't. Julia stepped closer. Her eyes scanned the names. Some sounded French, others looked Asian. A few she couldn't pronounce. She saw a little girl holding a teddy bear, standing in front of a hut. A boy with crutches beside a river. A group of girls in school uniforms, holding books. In the corner of the room was a large wooden trunk. Julia knelt beside it and slowly opened the lid. Inside were notebooks, carefully stacked. Old letters, some in envelopes, others folded neatly. She picked one and opened it. "Dear Mr. James, I passed my exams. I'm now in secondary school. Thank you for helping me when I had nothing. You're like an angel to me." She pulled out another. "You don't know what you did for me. But I sleep safely now. I eat every day. I don't cry at night anymore. I hope I make you proud. One more. The violin you gave me still plays. I name it after you. Thank you for being kind when no one else was." Letter after letter, all filled with soft, grateful words from children, young girls mostly, thanking Mr. James for things the world never saw, for kindness, for school fees, for protection. Julia clutched the papers to her chest. She didn't know what to think. Then she felt it. That quiet presence behind her. She turned quickly. Mr. James was standing in the doorway, his face calm, his voice was low. "I suppose it's time you knew the truth," he said. Julia stood frozen, the letters still in her hands, her heart thudding inside her chest. Mr. James Johnson walked slowly into the room. He didn't shout. He didn't look angry, just tired.
like someone carrying something heavy for too long. He closed the door gently behind him and looked around the room. Then he turned to her. "I suppose you have questions," he said softly. Julia's mouth felt dry. Her eyes moved to the photographs on the wall again. Her voice shook. Are these all girls you married?" James shook his head quickly. "No," he said firmly. "They were all girls I found, girls in danger, girls being sold, forgotten, thrown away. I didn't marry any of them." He looked at her now, fully, his expression serious, steady. "You're the first." Julia's brows pulled together. "Then why me?" James walked slowly to a small chair and sat down. His body sank into it with the weight of a long life. He let out a breath that sounded like it had been held in for years. "Because you were going to be married off anyway," he said. "You just didn't know it yet." Julia's heart dropped. He continued, his voice calm but firm. "I'd heard rumors in the village. A dangerous man, probably from some unknown group, had been coming to places like yours. He was taking girls. Some were kidnapped. Some were bought. Others given away in the name of marriage. Your village wasn't safe." Julia took a step back. James leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. "I noticed a strange man talking to you, just for a moment, at the market. That was the day before I came to your house. The way he looked at you, I knew then you were next." Julia's voice cracked. "You're lying." "I wish I were," James said, his voice trembling slightly. "I knew I had only two options. Let that man get to you first, or get there before him." She looked at the photographs again. Children, faces, smiles and stares. She understood now. These weren't trophies. They were memorials. James stood up slowly, walking over to the wall. He touched one of the frames gently, his hand lingering on the glass. "For the past 20 years, he said, I've been traveling, village to village, country to country, looking for girls like you. Girls no one noticed. Girls the world tried to forget." He looked at her again. "I didn't always succeed. Some of them," he nodded at the photos with the red X marks, "I couldn't save." Julia felt the letters slip from her fingers. He walked back to the trunk and picked up a notebook, opening it and reading softly. "Dear Mr. James, I learned how to read. I never thought I would. Thank you for believing I could." He closed it. "Sometimes I paid for school. Sometimes I built wells. Sometimes I just sat with them, listened, gave them shoes, gave them food. Some I tried to adopt. But the system, it doesn't always let people like me do that. So I did what I could, quietly, silently, off the record." Julia's voice broke the silence. "Why not use your money publicly?" she asked. "Build something, a school, an organization. You're rich, right?" He gave a small, bitter smile. "I was," he said, "but I sold most of it. And even then, money has limits. Sometimes the law listens more to men with power than men with purpose. The kind of work I did, if it had a name, people would try to stop it." He looked her in the eye. "I married you because that was the only way I could buy time. As you know, I am not young anymore. I am already 75, so I had to protect you, to give you a choice, one you were never going to have." Julia stood still in the center of the room, surrounded by pictures of lost children, letters of thanks, and the heavy truth she wasn't prepared for. And for the first time since she entered his house, she saw him not as a man with secrets, but as a man who carried the weight of saving the ones no one else would. She realized something that made her chest ache. He didn't save her because he had to. He saved her because no one else would. The days that followed were quiet. Julia and Mr. James Johnson didn't speak much, but they didn't need to. There was a soft understanding between them now, a stillness that didn't feel empty. It felt full, full of what had been said and what no longer needed to be explained. He still brought her tea in the morning, still left small cookies wrapped in linen. But now, when he looked at her, his eyes held something softer.
something like peace. Julia spent her time reading, writing, and watching the way the light moved across the house. James spent his time in the garden, or in the library, or simply sitting quietly in his study chair with the same calm silence that had always followed him. Then, on the morning of the 7th day, something was different. Julia waited for the soft knock at her door. It didn't come. She waited for the smell of tea, the sound of his footsteps on the tiles. But the house was silent. Too silent. She walked through the hallway barefoot, the cold floor under her feet. She checked the garden bench, empty. The library, empty. The study, still. Then finally, she walked to the room he never let her enter before, his bedroom. She knocked softly, once, twice, no answer. Her hand trembled as she turned the handle. The door creaked open slowly. There, lying peacefully on his side, was Mr. James Johnson, still in his robe, his silver hair resting gently on the pillow, his eyes closed, his chest still. Pale, quiet, still, gone. Julia didn't move. She didn't scream. She stood there, the sound of her own breathing suddenly louder than it had ever been. He had known. He had known his time was close. That's why he came here. That's why he moved so quickly. That's why he chose her. He had been dying. And he didn't want to leave this world without giving one last girl a second chance. She stepped forward slowly and sat beside the bed. Her hands shook as she opened the drawer beside him. Inside was a sealed envelope. It had her name written across the front. She opened it. The letter read, "Julia, if you're reading this, I'm gone. But that's okay. I've lived my life. Now it's time for you to live yours. You'll find documents in the study. Your name is now on everything I own. Land, savings, property. But the most important thing I leave you isn't money. It's freedom. Don't waste it." She pressed the letter to her chest. And for the first time, Julia wept. Not out of fear, not out of confusion, but out of love. The news of James Johnson's death spread quietly at first. A whisper among the large house staff. A quiet phone call to a lawyer in the city. Then, it spread like fire through the village. People gathered at the gates with flowers, folded hands, and questions they didn't dare say out loud. Some cried, others stared in disbelief. But what no one expected was the will. Exactly 4 days after his death, a lawyer arrived with papers and a solemn voice. She held a sealed brown folder tight in her arms. Her name was Mrs. Williams, a lawyer from the city. She didn't waste time. Inside that folder was a handwritten testament, notarized, stamped, legally binding. Julia, barely 12 years old, was listed as Mr. James Johnson's sole heir. The villagers were stunned. Mrs. Williams stood before the local elders and read the will herself. She explained that James had bought the house on the hill just a few months ago. He knew time was short. He knew exactly what he was doing. Everything had been arranged in secret, with care. And now, everything was Julia's. Some villagers whispered blessings. Others muttered curses. Her mother, standing under the mango tree, fainted when she heard the words. The elders gathered the next morning, meeting in hushed voices behind closed doors. Children pointed from the road as she walked by. How can that poor girl own the land now? She was just selling oranges last week. He only married her to trick the system. It's witchcraft. It has to be. But Julia said nothing. She didn't speak. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She just listened, quietly, just like James used to. Back in the mansion, she sat in the library, surrounded by silence. She ran her fingers along the books he once read. She ate the same soup he once brought to her room. She sat in his favorite chair and looked out the same window. The silence was loud, but she didn't mind it anymore. On the 3rd day, Mrs. Williams returned with another folder, this one filled with transition documents. "There's enough money to last you until university and beyond," she said gently. You don't have to decide anything now, but we will need to name a legal guardian to oversee the estate until you're of age. Julia looked up. Do I have to leave? She asked softly. Mrs. Williams blinked, surprised. No, this house is yours. James made it very clear. You can stay as long as you like. Julia sat back in the soft chair, the truth coming to her in slow, heavy waves. She had her own bed, her own books, her own keys. And now, her own decisions. The first one she made shocked everyone. She reopened James's ledgers. She called Mrs. Williams, and she gave clear instructions. They were to withdraw part of his remaining funds, but not for herself, for the village, for the children. She ordered full repairs on the clinic that had once refused to treat her brother, so the people of the village could at least have basic health care. No more turning away children who couldn't pay. She had a small school built right on the spot where she once sat in the dust selling oranges. She bought chairs, books, uniforms, and paid the first teacher's salary herself. Then she gave one more quiet instruction. From now on, any girl under the age of 18 could no longer be married in secret, not without being reported to a new registry managed directly from her estate. It didn't matter who tried to hide it. The registry would know. Some called her dangerous. Some called her cursed, but others, they started calling her something else. The girl who came back with fire. One cloudy afternoon, Julia walked alone to the cemetery at the edge of the village. The wind danced gently between the trees. She carried something in her hand, a small photo frame. It was James's favorite, the one of a mirror resting beneath a blossom tree, its branches full and soft. She walked slowly to the fresh stone and placed the frame gently on the ground beside it. Then she knelt down and whispered, "You weren't my husband. You were never even my father. You were my light." The wind moved through the leaves, and for a moment, she thought she heard it say, "Live." Weeks passed, then months. The mansion on the hill, once quiet and distant, began to change. It became more than just a house. It became a sanctuary, a place where young girls could sleep without fear, where they could read, eat warm food, and begin again. It was no longer just Julia's home. It was theirs. One girl, Jemima, aged 9, had been rescued from a forced engagement to a man 4 times her age. She came with nothing but a torn dress and a silent cry in her eyes. Another girl, Binta, only 11, had run from an abusive uncle who had kept her hidden for months. She arrived at the gates barefoot, her voice barely louder than the wind, and Julia let them in, not as a queen, not as a savior, but as one of them. She gave them rooms, she gave them food, but most of all she gave them something they hadn't known in a long time: safety. Some nights, Julia would walk the halls with her notebook in hand, writing slowly by candlelight, stopping outside the girls' rooms to listen for nightmares. One rainy evening, while dusting the books in James's library, she reached for one of his favorite titles, the one with the red spine and gold lettering. As she opened the cover, an envelope slipped out. It had no name on the front, only a line: "If they come for you, don't be afraid." Julia's fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside was a list: names, dates, locations, dozens of them. Some were government officials, some were diplomats, some were powerful men she had heard whispered about in the news, in market stalls, in the corners of the village. Men tied to child marriage, trafficking, and buying girls under the disguise of tradition and charity. These were not just monsters. They were protected monsters. And James had been watching them all along. Her heart pounded. She turned the page. At the very bottom in James's neat handwriting was one final message. "Use your voice, Julia. Burn the dark. They can't kill light when it knows who it is." She read the words again and again, the ink smudged slightly by time and rain. That night, Julia sat in the center of the library floor, surrounded by the faces of the girls on the wall, her notebook open beside her, the envelope still in her lap. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. She just stared at the candle burning in front of her. And that's when she made her second decision. She wouldn't just build homes. She would build a movement. 1 year later, The world knew her name. Julia Johnson. No longer a child bride in a forgotten village, but a global voice for girls like herself, girls who had once been invisible. Her story began to spread when a journalist from Lagos arrived at the hilltop house, chasing a rumor about a 12-year-old inheriting a wealthy man's estate. What they found was more than a headline. They found a revolution. Julia had grown, not just in height, but in strength. Her voice was still soft, but now, when she spoke, ministers listened. When she wrote, people shared. When she entered courtrooms, traffickers flinched. With Mr. James's list in hand, and the support of Mrs. Williams, Julia launched a movement that shook the foundations of silence. It was called the Johnson Report, named not just in memory of James, but in honor of the fire he carried and passed on. The report was detailed, terrifying, undeniable. It exposed networks. It named names. It pointed fingers at men in power who had hidden behind tradition, behind money, behind fear. They tried to silence her. They sent threats. They hacked her files. They spread lies. But they were already too late. Because James hadn't just left her a house. He had left her proof. He had left her a plan. And most importantly, he had left her an army, survivors, teachers, mothers, quiet donors from his past, and young girls who now had something they never had before, a future. By the time she turned 14, Julia had spoken at the United Nations. By 15, she had helped change legislation in 3 African countries, making child marriage under 16 punishable by international law. And by 16, she returned to the same dusty village where it all began, not with guards, not with cameras, but alone. She stood in front of the small school she had built, right where she once sold oranges for her sick brother. Around her, girls laughed, played, and learned. They held books, not burdens, wore smiles, not chains. She looked at them and smiled. "I used to be afraid of silence," she said softly, "but now I know. Silence is where we grow strong." One small girl raised her hand shyly. "Are you a queen now?" Julia laughed gently. "No," she said. "Queens wear crowns." She tapped her temple with 2 fingers. "I carry fire." That night, after the village fell asleep, Julia sat alone in the old library. Once his, now hers. The walls were filled with new books, hand-drawn portraits, and letters from rescued girls around the world. She lit a candle, opened her journal, and wrote quietly, "I hope you see me now." The flame flickered. A soft breeze passed through the window, and for just a moment she could have sworn she heard his voice. Steady, proud, warm. I always did. But this time Julia didn't cry. She stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the world that once tried to forget her. A world that now whispered her name with respect. They didn't just call her the girl who inherited a mansion. They called her the girl who carried fire.